Today, we pull back the curtain on one of the most misunderstood, morally fraught, and strategically catastrophic chapters in modern American history. The full, unvarnished story of how the United States intervened in the civil wars of Vietnam and Laos, a dual conflict that began in secret, escalated into a full-scale ground war, and left a trail of death, destruction, and national trauma that haunts America to this day. To understand America's intervention, we must start, not in the 1960s, but in 1954, at the end of the First Indochina War. The French colonial army suffered a crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu, ending nearly a century of French rule in Indochina. The Geneva Accords split Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's communist-led Viet Minh controlling the north and a pro-Western government taking charge in the south. The Accords explicitly promised nationwide elections by 1956 to unify the country, a vote U.S. intelligence privately admitted Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide with an estimated 80% of the popular vote. Rather than accept a democratic outcome that would bring communism to a unified Vietnam, the Eisenhower administration made a fateful choice. It refused to sign the accords, blocked the elections, and poured money, arms, and CIA support into South Vietnam to prop up the authoritarian regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. This was the first step in a long chain of decisions that would turn a local civil war into a global proxy fight. The driving force behind this choice was the domino theory, the core ideological belief that defined U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia. Washington policymakers argued that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, would topple one after another, like a row of dominoes, giving the Soviet Union and China an unstoppable foothold in Asia. This theory was not based on on-the-ground intelligence. It was a product of Cold War hysteria, a refusal to recognize that Vietnamese and Laotian fighters were first and foremost nationalists, fighting against foreign domination, not mere pawns of communist expansion. Eisenhower's team saw Indochina not as a region with its own history, culture, and desires, but as a chessboard in a global battle against communism, and they were willing to sacrifice any number of lives to win a single square. By the end of the 1950s, Diem's brutal, corrupt regime had alienated nearly all South Vietnamese, sparking a grassroots insurgency known as the Viet Cong, backed by North Vietnam. When John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited a crumbling situation in South Vietnam. Kennedy, a committed Cold Warrior, rejected calls to withdraw and instead escalated U.S. involvement, sending military advisors instead of combat troops. By 1963, the number of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam skyrocketed from 900 to over 16,000. These troops were not just trainers. They participated in covert raids, intelligence gathering, and combat operations, blurring the line between advice and active warfare. Meanwhile, in neighboring Laos, an officially neutral country torn by its own civil war between the royal government and the communist Pathet, Lao, the CIA launched a secret war. The agency, armed and trained Hmong guerrillas, carried out covert sabotage and began small-scale bombing to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines, all without congressional approval or public knowledge. Laos was already a battlefield, even as most Americans had never heard its name. The moment that unlocked full-scale U.S. intervention came in August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The U.S. destroyer, USS Maddox, reported being fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats in international waters. Days later, a second unconfirmed attack was claimed by the Johnson administration. Declassified documents and historical records now prove the second attack never happened. It was a false alarm, misread, radar signals, and political theater. President Lyndon B. Johnson, eager to expand U.S. military power without declaring war, used these incidents to demand the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress. The resolution passed with near-unanimous support, granting Johnson sweeping authority to take all necessary measures to defend U.S. interests in Southeast Asia. This single piece of legislation became the legal foundation for a war that would never be formally declared by Congress, a betrayal of the U.S. Constitution's war powers, and a blueprint for presidential overreach that would echo for decades. In 1965, Johnson pulled the trigger on full-scale war. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive years-long bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began targeting factories, bridges, roads, and civilian areas. Soon after, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Da Nang, and the troop count exploded. By 1969, over 540,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, fighting a brutal guerrilla war against an enemy that knew the terrain, had the support of local civilians, and was willing to fight for generations. The war was defined by horrific tactics, search and destroy missions, the use of Agent Orange to defoliate jungles, poisoning millions, and causing generational birth defects and mass civilian casualties. But the war did not stay contained within Vietnam's borders. It spilled directly into Laos, turning the secret war into a humanitarian catastrophe. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of dirt roads, jungle paths, and supply routes running through eastern Laos and western Vietnam, was the lifeline for North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. To cut this line, the U.S. launched the most intense bombing campaign in human history, all kept secret from the American public. Between 1964 and 1973, U.S. warplanes flew more than 580,000 bombing missions over Laos, dropping over 2 million tons of ordnance, more than the total bombs dropped by all nations during World War II. Laos, a small landlocked neutral country, became the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Over 200,000 Laotian civilians died, a tenth of the nation's population. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, and millions of cluster bomblets failed to detonate, leaving 80 million unexploded ordnance scattered across farmland and villages. To this day, these bombs kill and maim Laotian children and farmers, a silent, ongoing legacy of a war they never asked for. The CIA ran this entire campaign, operating without congressional oversight, lying to the public about where bombs were falling and who was being killed. By 1968, the war was unraveling. The Tet Offensive, a coordinated surprise attack by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces across South Vietnam, shocked the American public. Though the U.S. military repelled the offensive, it exposed the lie that the war was being won. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, declared the war a stalemate, and public support collapsed. Johnson, his presidency broken, announced he would not seek re-election, and began peace talks. When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he promised peace with honor and a policy of Vietnamization, shifting combat duty back to South Vietnamese troops, while slowly withdrawing U.S. forces, but Nixon's secretly expanded the war, intensifying the bombing of Laos and invading Cambodia in 1970, further destabilizing the region and sparking massive protests at home. The end came slowly and painfully. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, forcing the U.S. to withdraw all combat troops within 60 days. The last U.S. troops left Vietnam in March 1973, but the bombing of Laos continued until August of that year. For 2 more years, South Vietnam's army fought on its own, weakened by corruption, low morale, and dwindling U.S. aid. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government surrendered. The iconic images of U.S. helicopters evacuating personnel from the embassy roof, desperate Vietnamese civilians clinging to the skids, became the symbol of America's humiliating defeat. In Laos, the Pathet Lao seized power months later, ending the civil war and establishing a communist government. The human cost of America Indochina intervention is almost too staggering to comprehend. More than 58,000 U.S. service members died, and over 150,000 were wounded, many with lifelong physical and psychological scars. On the Indochinese side, over 2 million Vietnamese civilians died, along with 730,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. In Laos, 200,000 civilians perished in the secret war, and millions more were displaced. The economic cost tops $686 billion in direct spending, fueling inflation, budget deficits, and economic stagnation in the U.S. Politically, the war shattered public trust in the federal government, the presidency, and the military, giving rise to a culture of skepticism that reshaped American politics for generations. Strategically, the domino theory was proven completely wrong. Communism did not spread across Southeast Asia, and the war weakened America's global standing for decades. What makes this chapter of history so vital to understand today is not just the death toll or the military defeat. It is the warning it carries about the dangers of ideological extremism, secret warfare, presidential overreach, and ignoring the will of people in foreign lands. Every step of the way, U.S. leaders chose fear over facts, secrecy over transparency, and war over diplomacy. They saw a civil war for national unification as a communist takeover, a small neutral country as a battlefield, and a people's struggle for freedom as a threat to American power. The Indochina Wars were not a mistake. They were a series of deliberate, morally compromised choices, built on a foundation of lies and paranoia. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American history, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more epic history. See you next time.